Welcome back to Valpkonsultpodden. Today I have Gerard O'Shea here, and we have a common friend, and she wrote to me and said, can you take Gerard? He's so interesting, and I would like to hear when you talk about something with him. And I was like, okay. He is a judge, FCI judge. He's been that for 35 years, and he is also a breeder. He's been breeding mostly Rottweilers for a long time. He said himself for 45 years. And I'm like, I think breeding is interesting. It's nothing that I've been doing myself on a big scale, but I've been like on shows with my own dogs, and I've always thought that it's kind of strange because it's only about how the dogs look, and I was like, so strange. But I think he also teaches dog anatomy, and I was like, what can I talk about with a guy like this? And then I thought, okay, I can talk about extreme breeding, but I was like, maybe he wouldn't think it's a good idea, but he did. He thought it was a good idea, and he said yes. So now I have him here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. And I also asked him, he speaks Swedish as well, but I asked him if we could do this in English. And my English is kind of rusty. It's not...
I think your English is fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, when you speak English with a little bit of an accent, it makes it a little bit more exotic. So there you go. Yeah. So we have an exotic vibe going on here.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we talked about it. You used to live in Stockholm, but now you moved out.
Yeah, I came to Sweden. It was, if I remember, September '95 actually when I came first, and with no intention of staying whatsoever. I had this a little bit, as we say in Ireland, wing it as it's going, see what happens. And in the beginning, I didn't take anything too serious. I didn't plan to settle down, whatever. And then I come up with this idea that I thought there wasn't a strong culture, especially for handlers in Sweden, in the sense that I felt that teaching people how to present their dogs, what to think of, how to create a concept that would be not only beneficial to the handlers, but would also give the dogs a lot of respect. Because in the past, many handling techniques, especially where they didn't use candy or food of some kind, could be quite brutal actually, and quite forceful. And so I started, I had a contact in the Swedish Kennel Club actually, and I started in the garage under the Kennel Club. And I remember actually, it was interesting, I put out advertisements. This was before the internet was big, you know, and put out advertisements in the local working dog club and different organizations that had connections with dogs to make a little bit of a contact with people. And my Swedish friends, many of them says, it will never work, we never do this, you know. And so anyway, after several weeks, I had my opening night, everything was going to be ready, and I had everything set up, and I was super excited. And one person came. And I actually still remember his name. It was a guy called Mark Emlund. And I remember he was the only one there, you know. And I was a bit disappointed, but I thought, okay. And my Swedish friends were saying, I told you it wouldn't work. And so I gave him like a free lesson for the hour or whatever. And I remember distinctly saying to myself, I'm not going to charge him. And I said to him, if you're happy with the lesson, if you're happy for the concept, I said, just come back again and bring a friend. Yeah. And then a week later, he came back alone again. Yeah. I gave him another free lesson, and then it wasn't really a great start, you know. And then the third week he came back with some people, and a couple of more people came. And within 2 months, I had so many people, I couldn't cope with the numbers. Yeah. And because I come up with the idea that I made a point of not to try to be Swedish, to be actually the opposite, to be impulsive, even to be a bit loud, to swear sometimes, but not in an aggressive form. You know, to get people to say, "Look, we are adults here. It's not like you never heard this word before." That type of thing, you know. And then I realized from a very young age, I always had what we would say a dab hand with dogs. I could handle dogs very easy, even problem dogs. But I never took a lot of time to actually think about what was I actually doing with the dog that made the dog feel better or get a result, or whatever. And so then I had to come up with concepts that would actually help, that I could say to you, we do it this way because blah, 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 if you're looking from the dog's perspective. So, and and it just grew and grew. And I think, luckily for me, the internet took off nearly the same time. And then people would start to recommend me, not really in a formal sense. I reckoned my success today has a lot to do with luck. People would say, "Oh, I went to a class with this guy, blah, blah, blah. He's from Ireland, so therefore I was a little bit exotic because I was different." And then they would tell someone else in another town, and then they were interested. "Do you think you would come to Jönköping or to Gothenburg or whatever?" And I got requests through that. And then next thing, people were having contact internationally because Facebook was exploding. And then before I know it, I had people contacting me on Facebook. Then I started traveling to different countries. And then it wasn't long before I had thousands of people every year in different countries. And the traveling is fun, and learning from different dog cultures, if you like to say, even though dogs are dogs, how people interact with dogs and how they treat dogs and how they value dogs. It's not exactly the same in every country.
No, it's
so
different.
So therefore, you see a difference. Like for me, a huge step was Russia, actually, which is very topical at the moment. But and was Russia because I felt that they were the whole shaping concept. They were like, I felt like they were 50 years out of date. And when I got there, I had to explain, I remember, the concept of shaping and not forcing, and the long-term benefits with it. But I will say, not to contradict myself, as a trainer, I don't believe in no consequence training. I believe that when we use terms like, for example, correction, people would say, "Oh, I need to correct my dog." And I would always say, you can't correct it if you didn't first teach it. So you have to teach it. And then when you know that the dog is making an active choice not to comply, then you can do some form of correction. But correction as a means of teaching, I think, is really outdated and stupid. But I think the modern world now, to some degree, even with kids, and maybe even with and definitely with dogs anyway, I think we're suffering from this, that there's no consequence to anything. It's almost gone the opposite way. It's swung from being quite brutal and harsh all the way to the opposite direction, that everything is candy and click and this, and no matter how bad it gets, it's like patience. And I think you can't have only sun. You have to have a bit of rain sometimes. You have to have... To appreciate the heat, you need the cold. You know, so it's a balance, and I think people are masters at going to the extreme in many different areas. I mean, from Obama to Trump, how is it possible a whole nation can swing? And probably when they went from Trump, who did they go to? Biden. I mean, it's like swinging in opposite directions. We struggle with the concept of the Swedish word lagom, which is like in the middle somewhere, or just enough, or not too little, or not too much, you know. So, and I think into our subject that we spoke a little bit about on the phone about breeding, I think it manifests itself also in breeding. That people struggle to understand what enough is, or what is optimal rather than extreme.
You know, that was one of the reasons why I actually stopped being a veterinarian, because I kind of, when I started, I came to Sweden in 2010, and then all these brachycephalic dogs, they were quite popular, but they were not so popular as today. They were like, every now and then you saw a mops or a French bulldog, but it was not like every other dog was a French bulldog. And I was like, okay, maybe people will understand that this is not healthy, and maybe they will start, when they realize that they will stop buying these dogs or do something with the way the dogs look. But the more I worked, the longer I was working, the more of these dogs I've seen. It was like every other dog became a dog without a nose. And then I was like, okay, so people are not really getting it. And you know, it was also, I think it's a little bit less now, but also in marketing, all different companies, they use these dogs because they're cute, so they just put pictures of them everywhere. So people start thinking that this is a normal dog, because it's like accepted. It's generally accepted that dogs can look like that.
Do your audience that will listen to this, do they understand the term brachycephalic?
Yeah, I have talked about this before, and I call them dogs without nose, because I think they don't have, I mean, some of the dogs, they even, it looks, when you look at them from the side, they look like the nose is behind their eyes. So they don't have any nose. They'll have like an opening in the skull, but there is no nose. If you compare this with the German Shepherd, there is no nose.
Yeah.
So yeah, I call them dogs without nose, but brachycephalic, that's like the whole group. And I've talked about this before. It's the bulldogs, it's the mops, it's the you name it. I mean, it's the Affenpinscher. There is many of these dogs that don't have a nose.
Yeah, I remember when we spoke on the phone, you said something about that the recent implications of, we say, unhealthy breeding in Norway, that they've outlawed certain breeds.
Yeah,
and you were saying you thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, it's very recently when I read it. It's just some weeks ago that in Norway they banned some of the brachycephalic breeds. I think it was like French bulldog, mops, and English bulldogs. And I was like, I'm quite open to it, because actually I'm a very liberal person. I'm actually so liberal that I think even drugs should be allowed, because I think everybody should have the choice to do what they want, and then like take their own consequence of their actions. But this is not a consequence of action on your own person. This is like an action on someone else. So I feel like people don't really understand it. It's like, it's a little bit similar like with using plastic. If somebody will not say you can't use plastic, we have to stop with this, people will not do it. If you just we recommend that you don't use plastic, it will never happen. Yeah. And then I start to feel a need that maybe you just have to say, sorry, it can't look like this. Maybe you don't have to stop the breed, but maybe you should like give a specific look. This is how it can look, and this is how it cannot look. Okay,
well, from, if you like to say, a moral perspective, I can understand that, of course, all breeding has responsibility. You have a responsibility to it. And I think what Norway did is the wrong direction. Because I think if you ban something, it will just be replaced with something else that's extreme. I think the way to go is education, but I also believe that the problem is, I was thinking a little bit about what you said, that in your job you started to see, it started to affect you, and that you had more and more dogs coming that were sick. And I was thinking that maybe your point of view is a little bit narrow because of your job.
Yeah, it could be, because I had this idea that all dogs are sick.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be a little bit like, just say if I was talking to a doctor and he said, shit, the human race is falling apart because everybody I meet is sick. Yeah. Then you go, no, well, maybe we're living longer than ever. So I think you have to, looking at it strictly from a vet's perspective, I can understand that you could be overwhelmed because the only reason people would go there is because they're sick. But I can say, from a trainer's perspective, and like I stated earlier, I've had like thousands of dogs every year internationally. And these certain breeds of a more extreme nature, especially the pocket-sized breeds, like smaller breeds, have become more popular. But I have noticed that if you go to international shows and you see what would be considered to be the top specimens in these breeds, whether you like the form or not, these top specimens, that the vast majority of them, I would see them as having a good life in the sense that they seem to be active, they seem to be able to run around, people go for walks. One of the things I will say about Scandinavia is that I think Scandinavian people in general look after their dogs extremely well compared to many countries.
Yeah.
And they exercise their dogs, and because we have an astonishing amount of people that live in apartments, people are out moving the dogs. They're not just putting them out in the garden and that's the only place they see. They're out moving the dogs. And I have come across numerous customers that they want to show the dogs, but they also do agility with the dogs. Now, they don't have aspirations as to compete with a border collie, but the dog still finds it fun. And I think if you can, I have a few basic rules which sound a little bit crude now, but basically if a dog can mate, if it can have a normal pregnancy, and without a genetic defect actually be capable of having pups itself. I mean, all breeds can need a C-section for various reasons, but I'm not talking about genetical reason. That can be bad luck. Can eat normal, can breed to the point that the dog can actually take a decent walk, run in the forest, have fun like any other dog, and so forth. So I think the idea that taking away these breeds, because I think what will happen is people who are involved in dogs or involved in animals in general will pick another extreme, but maybe in another direction, not necessarily the length of the nose and so forth, but that you can prove that the dog is functional as a basic dog, even though he comes in a variation of packages. And I think that this is important. And I've been thinking about this a lot after we spoke, and I thought to myself that when you consider, like in people, how many potential sicknesses that we have, not just in dogs, same in people, and some of these sicknesses we will never be rid of. We have a recessive element that will always be there genetically, and all we can do is study it. Maybe, hopefully in the future we can do something about it, but more importantly, it's kind of like baggage that has to go with it. And then some of them are man-made. I absolutely get that. So if you were to take a list of what can happen from, we say, spondylosis to patella problems to thyroid problems to epilepsy to, I mean, the list just goes on. And more or less all of this list exists also even in people to some degree and so forth. And if you were to take that list and you say, so what do? Do we go on a witch hunt and we chase every sickness? I don't think it's profitable, and I don't think people will do it. But I think something that organizations like the Kennel Club, who already have a strong interaction with the breeders, the Kennel Club also have, you could almost say, like the governing body over pedigree dogs. Yeah. At least in Scandinavia. There will be a section of breeders that breed outside of the Kennel Club. But of course, then we can recommend that people don't go to unreliable breeders. But if you take any of these breeds, and nowadays we know more or less, how old would we expect a healthy Great Dane to live to? How old should we expect a healthy French Bulldog to live to, or Rottweiler, or Poodle, or whatever the case? And when you take, we say if I take my own breed, Rottweiler, and we say, okay, if they make it to 8, they've had a full life. If they live longer, it's a bonus. Before 8, the probability was that they perhaps died of cancer, and we know that up to 50% of cancers are genetically based. And so when we consider in a breed like my own, and you think we're checking for hips and elbows. Some people believe we should check for thyroid problems, and some people even believe we should check for osteochondrosis in the hocks, and so the list can continue. But if, with the help of the Kennel Club and the breed clubs, if we were to come up with a concept, and I actually think that this is a good concept, and as a vet you could tell me what you think, is that we could give out an e-longevity certificate, and basically a certificate that says this dog, for example, if we take my breed, for example, Rottweiler, 8 years of age, e-longevity certificate bronze, we could call it. And he makes it to 9 years of age, we could say bronze 2. Makes it to 10, silver. 11, silver 2. 12, gold plus, and so forth. And I think something like this, if we were to do this across the board, then very quickly the general public will be able to see, without having to understand the medical research into all the possible sicknesses, would see very quickly this bloodline seems to be living a long time.
Yeah.
And one of the areas that I disagree on when it comes to the medical element, when it comes to breeding, for example, is that we should look under a microscope, for example, if we take osteochondrosis of the elbow, and define if you see a little piece of calcified growth that's maybe 1 millimeter long, define that dog to be sick.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no, it seems too extreme.
Yeah.
Because
if the dog is well,
functional,
if the dog, there's nothing wrong with
exactly.
the dog, then that calcification doesn't mean anything.
Exactly. So it becomes, that's where some of the health programs, I believe, go wrong, because they're chasing a problem rather than looking at the bigger picture and so forth. So if you're to give an e-longevity certificate, what would be amazing is that within 3 years, which is nothing, 3 years, we would already have indications as to what bloodlines have e-longevity. And the one overall measure of health that we could have, not only for dogs, but for people, for horses, for anything, is a mark of e-longevity, to be able to say that they lived a proper age related to that breed, and even beyond, and I even think that some people might say that if you were to do a similar concept in people, which has been done, and we know in certain parts of the world, we understand that there's places in Japan that people live generally longer than, there's places in Italy as well. What we don't know is if it's purely environmental, if it's food-based, if it's genetical based and so forth, but
it's probably a combination.
It's probably a combination. So I would say that if you were to find that you had a breeder of French bulldogs, for example, and you could see that up into 8, 9, 10 years of age, that these dogs were active and able to have fun and run around and weren't visiting the vet every second month because of various problems, then regardless what the vet says or what we think of the form of that dog, the fact that the dog is able to survive to a ripe age and many of its relatives is an indication of health within itself. So I think the governing bodies, governing is probably the wrong word, but we say the bodies that have the most effect on people when it comes to breeding and when it comes to potential buying. And in Scandinavia, I have to say that the average dog owner who has no experience in either competing in the working dog club or in the kennel club and so forth, many of them still take the time to actually contact the kennel club for advice as to where can I find a reliable breeder. And I've seen that from my own breeding, that many of the people contact me and say, we've seen on the kennel club, the Swedish kennel club, that you have a litter of pups. And then you can even recommend what they should ask and so forth. And for example, one of the things I think is important, especially with my breed, but maybe with any breed, is that before anybody gets a pup from our kennel, we give free education before they buy the pup. And then we give follow-up education up to 4 or 5 times for the first year, because when you get over that first year, and I also advise people, when you get over that first year, generally, I won't say it's plain sailing, but things get easier. And what you do or don't do in that first year has basically an effect on the rest of its life, because you set up the foundations that work within your family. But then another thing I advise people to do, because I think we have a little bit of a dilemma, back to your veterinary experience, is that with the situation in Sweden, which was very different to how I grew up with dogs, is the insurance situation. Oh, I could do a whole podcast on that alone, because I think it's becoming a financial monopoly, that what's happening is that it's expected that everybody should have insurance. Even if they're struggling to feed the dog, you still should have insurance. And Sweden is not everybody in Sweden that has a dog is wealthy and can afford insurance, and insurance premiums are going up and up and up. And then when we look at the veterinary practice now, it's becoming monopolized between 2 giant companies. Yeah. They're taking over everything. And everything from just checking to see if the dog is still breathing, if it's in overnight, you get charged for everything. Yeah. And I think the thinking is almost, well, it's okay, you don't pay for it. Yeah. Your insurance pays for it. Yeah. But we do pay for it. Yeah. It's just we pay for it indirectly. Yeah. So I think the subject of breeding extreme dogs and the consequence of that, I think has to be looked at from multiple directions, not only in one direction. Yeah. And I 100% believe that the governing bodies, or the bodies that have the most influence anyway, kennel club, breed clubs and so forth, should be responsible for education, but shouldn't go down the road of witch hunting specific details. It would be financially more beneficial for everybody and easier for the average Svensson family to understand elongevity is elongevity. We can see that the grandmother to this puppy we're going to buy, she was 12. Her daughter was 11. Her daughter, after that, was 12 as well. And now her daughter, that's 4, is going to have pups. And they bred to a line that had something similar. That would state more to me as, if you like to say, a would-be buyer of a family dog, especially, than understanding the repercussions of brachycephalic or osteochondrosis or potential epilepsy or whatever the case, because it gives an overall statement as to where the breeding program is, rather than a microscopic statement into the elbow or whatever the case. I don't know what you think from a vet's perspective. What do you think of that idea?
It sounds good. I mean, it's true also that is I think it's quite high genetic, like if you will be 100, probably your father and father's father was also 100. Yeah. If you didn't die in a car crash.
Yeah.
But it's the longevity.
It's a difficult word. Yeah. Elongevity. Yeah.
Elongevity. Yeah. It is it's quite common that your parents and parents' were living long life,
or at least for their time. Because that has changed, obviously, with lifestyle, with food, with medical intervention, and so forth, And I think is, I can't think of another way that you could create a blanket statement of health. But even more important is that, because I think this is where it gets a little bit difficult when we think pedigree dogs. If you think about the dedicated breeders, and I've been involved in breeding for a long time, is that breeders and kennel clubs and breed clubs are trying to preserve what we say a breed was originally developed for. Whether it was for, we say, a tranquil pastime like a pet, like a Pekingese in royal gardens and so forth, or whether it was a hunting dog that went out and hunted. Now, because many of the tasks we originally had for dogs, because of change in society, we have lost those tasks. We don't need the dog in the same way. He still plays a valuable role, but not quite in the same way. For example, dogs that were bred for pig hunting or wild boar. We don't need it in the same way today as it would have been at one time. But I do believe, like in the preservation of anything in our culture, whether it be architecture, whether it be art, whether it be even fashion, that the preservation of this and recognizing where it came from and the evolution of it and how it developed, I think should also be sustained in dogs. But like with anything, we have to put guidelines on it.
Yeah, because have you seen the pugs 100 years ago?
Yeah,
or 150 years ago?
I understand
they
that.
Look like
No, they didn't.
They looked totally different.
No, they did look different. Absolutely, I agree that. And so, do you say that? I mean, for those listening to us that may be breeders will understand a little bit more what I'm going to say now. When we use the word type, we often use the word type when we say that's typical, that's not typical, and when we use this word type, what it really refers to is breed typical characteristics. Now those characteristics are not only physical, they're also mental and also even from an athletic form as well. So when we use this word type, we look at dogs, then we have to understand that in developing type, does it mean we stay the same or can we maintain the type but improve it? So if you think a little bit like a sports car. Yeah. Sports car had a form in the 50s, and that form is changing all the time in order to increase performance. But that is for performance for better. Sometimes what happens in the breeds that perhaps don't have an active job anymore, other than, in some cases, a family pet, or I dread to say, I know that there are people that use dogs as almost like a fashion accessory and so forth, that there has to be a limit to how much you should push that type, because if you push that type to be too extreme, it is no longer typical. No. It becomes the opposite. No. But so where do we draw those boundaries? Because your perspective of what is attractive or beautiful or pleasing to you and my perspective will never be exactly the same, whether it's art or fashion or anything like that. That's purely objectional. And so where do we draw the line? And that's where I think instead of having, which is very easy, I think, for Scandinavian society, let's place loads of rules. But people will just find an avenue through those rules if they can. Or they will step outside the governing body and do unregistered breeding, or whatever the case. Yeah, or I think happens. It does happen, yeah. Or they will import. Now we have free trade in Europe. Yeah. They'll go to a country that has less regulations and import what is on demand. Yeah. So I think we have to. That's where I think educating the public, and I really believe this e-longevity program is the way to go. And advise people, don't buy simply on how the dog looks. You have to a little bit look on your lifestyle, what you want, and maybe encourage people to ask if this certain form, type of dog is attractive to you, you think it could be suitable for you, then you have to ask yourself why. What is it? What is the reason you want this dog for? What do you want this? Is it purely aesthetic? 100%. And if it's aesthetic, do you realize that with this form may come this problem or that problem, or you may have to adjust your lifestyle to this? For example, it doesn't only have to be the brachycephalic. We have extreme forms in all types, in anatomy, in size, whether it's dwarfed or very big. Yeah. And so if you see a beautiful photograph of a Great Dane, it doesn't mean if you live in a one-bedroom apartment in Stockholm, it's the ideal dog for you. It could work if you're active and outside and so forth. Absolutely, anything can work. But I think to get people to think less emotionally and a little bit more pragmatically. But I think making rules like what Norway did is the wrong way to go. I really believe it's the wrong way to go. I think maybe putting a little bit more pressure. And I would like to say, I hope that somebody in the kennel club or breed clubs will get a chance to listen to this. One of the things I will say is that if we don't take some element of responsibility, and responsibility then becomes governed at governmental level,
Yeah.
or
What do you
even
mean, like with
worse.
the drugs? I
Well,
mean,
yeah,
like
or
if-
with
if
anything,
we say
or
this is
even
for-
worse, European level.
Yeah.
We say if a rule came in on a European level that we are no longer allowed to blah blah blah, whatever, breed this or breed that, and suddenly it's out of our control. So I think it's smarter, if we want to preserve the breeds, that we take the responsibility and show that we are pushing for the welfare of maintaining the breed, but also governing in some respects the limitation as to how exaggerated they should be, if you take from a health perspective and so forth. Like, for example, there are many breeds. I think it's easy, unfortunately, for us to see because of the way we live today, I think it's easy for us to be attracted by the